It's just really inspiring to see that they're still going anyway. Like, it's so much more complicated and expensive and hard to do, but they're so committed to their craft and to creating entertainment that people want to see that they're saying, it's hard, but we're going to do it anyway. Well, hey, wait a minute. This is the first episode of 2021. Welcome to the new year. To celebrate, I thought I'd talk about something that has nothing to do with 2020. Oh, wait, no, I'm talking about COVID-19. Whoops. It's time to sit down and put in those earbuds so as not to disturb the neighbors, because this is Off Book, a podcast all about Broadway, movies, TV shows, and so many other nerdy things. I'm your host, Marc Stoufer III, and today I'm going to be talking about COVID-19. The pandemic has impacted pretty much everybody in some way, shape, or form, but a group that not a lot of people often think about is film and TV production. Because while it's not coming as frequently as it was in the before times, entertainment is still being released. Some of it was probably shot before the lockdown, so it's just post-production and release that's affected it, but there are also a lot of them that have had to find a way to write and film during a pandemic. And if you want to know what that looks like, then you're in luck. It just so happens that that's what this episode's about. I really didn't know until I started doing the research for this episode how many precautions there were on a film set to make sure that everyone was safe. It's definitely a good thing, and I'm very glad that there are this many precautions and that the people that are in charge of film productions are requiring this many precautions to make sure that, everyone stays safe, especially with how many people are on a film set. But I didn't realize just how many there were. I also didn't realize there isn't a ton of consistency between film to film or studio to studio because there aren't a ton of actual guidelines for film sets. Obviously, the CDC is recommending some things, and individual cities have their own requirements, but as far as what to do on a film set, there isn't really a clear set of guidelines. Some studios have created guidelines for all of their productions, but it's not like there's an organization that's creating those guidelines for each studio to use. So if I were to work on a production for two different studios, they might be handling this in two different ways. One thing that's consistent, though, is that it's very hard to film during a pandemic. A film set is a place where there are a whole bunch of people that are all constantly crowding around each other, and they're always kind of crossing back and forth and talking to each other, and it's very collaborative, it's very intimate. There's people are constantly just invading each other's privacy and dressing rooms, and there's a section to this film set called Video Village where there's the director and all the different crew heads that are watching a monitor to see what the camera sees, so that way they know if it looks good from the camera's point of view. People are constantly crowding around each other, and that's not something that is allowed during a pandemic. And so what film sets have started doing is creating zones. There are generally three zones. There's an A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3 zone. And so there's one zone that everyone's allowed to go to. That's where, craft services is. That's food for all the non-filmmakers in the audience. But instead of a communal snack table, it's individually prepackaged foods that are eaten at a table that is 6 feet away from anybody else's table. And then from there, the two other zones are increasingly restricted on who can go in there. So you need to get a colored wristband that shows you have permission to be in this zone, and there are only certain amounts of people in each zone, and there are only certain kinds of people in each zone, and it helps to kind of eliminate some of that cross-pollination. The only required people can go into certain areas to make sure that we have as few people as possible contaminating anybody else. People also have to constantly change their masks. One day of a film shoot can be very, very long, and so making sure that you're consistently changing your mask to make sure that all the germs you have created into your mask are disposed of and you don't accidentally contaminate somebody else, because safety is super important when you have that many people together, especially during a pandemic. You also have people having to get tested sometimes as many as 3 times a week for COVID to make sure that at every single possible opportunity the producers know if anyone is infected, because if somebody's infected they have to leave, which can drastically impact a film schedule because every single person is so important on a film set, and if you lose one of those people, do you have to replace them? Do you have to work without them? Do you have to delay the film shoot? There are so many considerations, but none of those can happen until you know who has what, so it's important that they get tested as often as possible. There are also, I mentioned Video Village, where there's a whole bunch of people crowded around one monitor, and the way that they're replacing that on some film shoots is for everybody to have their own individual iPad. So the camera is connected to a whole bunch of iPads, probably wirelessly, and there's a whole bunch of people standing socially distanced apart because everybody has to socially distance on a film set except for the actors when they're on camera, if it's not possible to be socially distant in the scene. And so they're all watching and they're kind of talking from there, but it's a very different environment, and it changes the mood, it changes the efficiency, it changes a lot about how that team can operate if they're not all huddled around one monitor. It's also just a bunch of equipment and other things you have to add to the already crowded film set in order to do this. There was one set where they had to have an additional 90 sinks, 200 hand sanitizer stations, and they had to complete somewhere around 50,000 swab tests throughout their 19-week shoot, which is just a lot. And especially when people are constantly moving around, you need to make sure that no matter where they are, there's always sinks and sanitizing stations available, and trying to constantly make sure that everyone's being safe and making sure that you find out if somebody has the virus. But it means that there's a lot more stuff there in a time when you're trying to eliminate the amount of stuff that's there. It does mean, on the slightly more positive side, that you have to be a little bit more precise. Filmmaking is often last-minute decisions on set when you have to decide what prop goes where, or when you should use this extra, or what you should do here, whereas now you can't really do as much of that when you're working on a big film set with a bunch of people, because you have to make all those decisions beforehand to make sure that you have the exact prop. You can't have extra things lying around, you can't have extra people. You need to know before you even step foot on that film set what you're going to do and what you need, which can be helpful sometimes because the studios are given more time to figure that out, which makes you feel more prepared. But also, COVID, so you're probably not actually feeling any more prepared. It's also incredibly hard when somebody on the set does get COVID, because as soon as they find out, that person and everybody surrounding that person has to quarantine. And the quarantine length is different, and the definition of who is in contact with them is different. Sometimes it's within 6 feet for more than 15 minutes, so over the last 48 hours is a pretty standard rule. Sometimes it's at all close to them, sometimes it's just different. There are a lot of different ways to determine who was in contact with whom and what kind of contact tracing you're using, so it's really hard to figure out, okay, who do we need to send to quarantine and for how long, and how is that going to impact our film shoot. It also means that they get less coverage of scenes, because for those of you that don't know, coverage refers to how many shots you have in a scene. So the shots you see in a particular scene in the final version may be only half or less of the amounts of shots that they actually got. Films like to get a lot of different shot options, so that way when they're editing they can choose which ones they like best and have more control, but that all takes a lot of time. So now they're trying to plan all of that ahead of time and use that control before they even step on set, which saves them time, but also means they have less creative control. So if something doesn't work in the edit, too bad. That's the only thing you shot. Not to mention that for a lot of indoor scenes, directors have to be like 300 feet away. That's not even an exaggeration. It was one film where they were filming a scene indoors and the directors were 300 feet away outside on the front lawn, which can be very hard when you're not even there. There are ways to communicate and to see with the mobile monitor things, but that can be super hard to try to direct something when you aren't even in the room. There are also a bunch of routine and surprise inspections by all the different agencies to make sure that you're doing everything safe, and if you're not, they're going to fine you or shut you down, and that can put a lot of stress on people because, not only do you need to do it, you need to be constantly making sure that you're doing it all the time, because you never know when someone is going to be checking, which, is probably not unreasonable stress because you should be doing that anyway, but it does mean that that's something else in your mind, because if you do mess up, it's not just a chance of somebody getting sick, it's a chance of somebody getting sick and a film shoot being shut down, which could put hundreds of people out of work. A lot of scenes are also being shot outdoors, which is great to help to eliminate the spread of COVID, but in places like California, when it's super hot out, there are a lot of people that are getting heat exhaustion and then getting sick and being sent home, which is not as bad as COVID, but does put just as many logistical issues into the production. It's just a bunch of logistical issues when you start to introduce this whole new element of production. Not to mention the money that they're sinking in, the money for all this COVID equipment and trying to get more iPads instead of the one monitor, trying to duplicate some things because they can't be moved from one zone to another, so they have to have two of them if they need multiple of them. They're trying to get hotel rooms for people to quarantine in. If somebody gets sick, they have to send them to a hotel sometimes and say, quarantine here, or sometimes they'll even get the entire cast and crew to quarantine anyway to make sure that they don't accidentally get sick outside of work. The cast of the most recent Mission Impossible movie quarantined on a cruise ship that Tom Cruise decided to rent, which is amazing. Is Tom Cruise about a cruise ship. Anyway, there's all these COVID tests. I mean, 3 tests a week for everybody involved sometimes. That can really add up. And even just like the signage that they have to put up, that does cost money to print. Even if it's just printer paper, even if you just type something up and print it, that will eventually cost money. If each of those pieces of paper costs 10 cents and you have to print 1,000 of them, that's going to cost you some money. Not to mention that when you do ask people to quarantine, you need to find a way to replace them, but also you still need to pay them, because if you don't pay them if they're quarantined, there's a higher risk that people aren't going to report if they're sick or try to find ways to work anyway because they need to be paid, because nobody gets to work except on these film productions because so much is shut down. So there's just so many logistical issues, and I think out of everything, it's just really inspiring to see that they're still going anyway. Like, it's so much more complicated and expensive and hard to do, but they're so committed to their craft and to creating entertainment that people want to see that they're saying, it's hard, but we're going to do it anyway. We think this is important enough that we're willing to deal with all these precautions, and we're going to make art anyway. Not to mention we're going to give people jobs, because that's not something that is easy to come by, especially in the arts nowadays, because they're very not essential to a lot of people. So I think it's really inspiring that they're continuing to do this. Today's episode is sponsored by my new movie. Not at all based on this past year's events. It's about a guy trying to survive COVID-23 and having to work around quarantines and, masks and, other stuff that's unrelated to this year. Wait, this is just Songbird, isn't it? Let's switch gears and talk about TV shows. TV shows have a lot of the same precautions as movies do, but they are, when it comes to precautions and trying to figure out the logistical issues, an entirely different medium to try to work around. Making a movie is different than making a TV show. So as far as the precautions go, they have a lot of the same issues to work around, like social distancing and zones and trying to eliminate non-essential staff. But something to consider is that where movies take several months, even years to make, TV shows are made in weeks. An episode of a TV show can be shot in less than a week. So if somebody comes with a positive test on a TV show, instead of it just being, okay, it's a couple weeks of this production that we don't have them, we have to find a way to work with that. That could push back the entire episode and get the entire schedule of the entire season to be messed up. And it creates so many more logistical errors because there's less time to film, so every positive test creates more of a ripple effect. A lot of the writing process for TV shows that normally happens in one room where everyone's kind of bouncing ideas off each other is virtual. And even though there are video conferencing platforms like Zoom or Google Meet or Skype, it's not going to capture the same feel as being in the same room. It makes it a lot harder to bounce ideas off each other when you're doing it over the internet and trying to share documents, and it just fundamentally you are writing a script in a different way. There are also less episodes to be produced. In order to accommodate the costs of all of these COVID precautions, a lot of studios have announced that they are producing 16 episodes a season instead of 22. Eliminating the cost of some episodes will help to kind of make up for the fact that they're spending so much more on making the episodes that they are making. Because they are spending so much more. There was one show that was estimated that the cost of each episode was ballooning by like 30%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you start to get into those TV episode budgets, that can be a huge number. And so they have to just start eliminating episodes in order to make that work on paper, because there are also a lot of shows that are just canceled because the studio doesn't think that it's worth paying that much money to make a show if it isn't doing super well. Of the 80 shows that were supposed to be shot in New York City around this time, only 35 are actually shooting, which shows just how hard it is to get a production off the page and on the ground in these weird times. The ones that are normally at like 50% capacity because they can't have that many people around, but also there were sometimes close to 40 people in the COVID division just making sure that everyone's staying safe and testing and trying to supervise and making sure that everything is handled, being logistical managers, and there's so much more work to do. They need to hire more people as they're trying to cut back on the amount of people that are there, which means they need to cut back even more. On some larger lots where there are sound stages that people are filming on, they report that someone tests positive about every 1 or 2 weeks, and that apparently they normally isolate them and continue to film and everything's safe, but it does show just how much of a risk it is to get this many people in a room together. Studios normally pay for testing and then have their own groups to help contact trace to get everybody safe, So they are putting in the work, but it is super hard to do and to continue to film as all these people are being quarantined here and there, and some of them are super important and some of them may not have a bunch of roles but are very crucial in the role that they're in. There aren't a lot of just random people on a film set. They all have a job to do, so when even one person gets pulled, let alone everybody that was in contact with them, it becomes a much bigger issue. Not to mention that the areas that it's safe to film in, like outside, are in higher demand to film anyway, because there aren't as many locations to film. So everybody has had their options to film cut in half, so the options that are left are in much higher demand, which makes it harder to film, which means not as many shows are being made, because a lot of them can't find locations to film, because other productions are filming there, because there are less options to choose from. It's a weird cycle. Not to mention that a lot of productions are filming in cities. They're filming on the streets of New York City, and it's super hard to find a way to isolate yourself from the pedestrians. Normally, pedestrians are constantly passing in the back of shots. There are some signs up that say, hey, we're filming a production here. If you pass through the street, you may be on TV, and people don't care, and they walk past the shot, and it's fine. Except when you're trying to film a film production, and everybody working on the production has been tested, and is tested negative, and everyone's safe, but then you're having these random people that haven't necessarily been tested, that you don't know, maybe they have COVID, and they're passing your film set and coming sometimes within 6 feet of the stars, and that means that they could have passed to the stars, and so you have to figure out all the time if the stars or anybody else have gotten COVID-19, and then you have to figure out how to logistically work with that. And so that becomes a bigger issue. Even the actors are socially distancing when they're not on screen. And sometimes even when they are on screen, a lot of times there are less group shots and more individual shots, so close-ups. So they'll shoot one wide shot where they're within 6 feet of each other, and then from then on, the rest of the scene will be shot in close-ups, where you think that the characters are next to each other because they were just standing next to each other, but really, the actors are alone on set now, except for the crew. And a lot of productions are starting to use remote cameras, where it's a camera that's on a robotic arm, and then somebody is in another room controlling the camera remotely, which means that the cameramen don't even have to be in the room trying to illuminate the amount of people as much as humanly possible. A lot of shows are also setting their productions during the pandemic, which means that there are characters that are wearing masks during the show, and there are people that are socially distancing during the show as part of the plot, which A, helps to address it and helps to plant it more in reality, and helps to help people kind of work through it because they're seeing these characters that they've grown attached to over the years work through this too, and it helps to kind of make them feel like they're not alone in this, but also makes it easier to film because you don't have to worry about potentially one of your actors passing it to another one while they have their masks off and are standing 2 feet next to each other because they're wearing masks and they're socially distancing. There are also less guest stars because that's introducing another person onto the set. There are less extras if you can avoid using extras because that's more people. There are also a lot of shows that have included less or even no scenes with the older actors that are in the show, even if they're series regulars, because the studio doesn't want to, or the actor doesn't want to, risk getting the older actor sick. So those scenes are maybe done virtually, or done separately, or just they're not in the show for a while, which can be an issue when those actors still need to work, but can't because they're older and their immune systems don't work quite as well, and you don't want to put them in danger, but they also do need to work. Talk shows are a little bit different because while they have a lot of the same precautions that they need to take, they're also filming in one studio, and so they don't need to worry about locations. They have the crew doesn't need to be as close because there aren't a ton of close-ups, and there are less people that are involved in the cast because it's generally just the host and then the band and maybe some guests. But guests are often coming in virtually, and if they are coming in to the studio in person, because a lot of shows have returned to the studio, they're not allowed to bring anybody with them. You know, they have their entourages, or maybe they have a family member or whatever that comes with them, and they can't do that anymore. It has to be just them to try to limit the amount of people that are even in the studio. Then a lot of sets have been redesigned to keep everybody 6 feet apart in the period where the show wasn't working from the studio, because a lot of shows were and still are working from home. So they'll have to try to figure out how to film a show from home, from the host's home, a host who normally doesn't know how to film a show, often using their family members and filming on iPhones and then trying to get it to the editor. They're Zooming with their guests, and that's super hard to do. Everything's constantly being cleaned if they're in the studio. A lot of people return to different places, such as a different studio in the same building, or the office building, or sometimes even a local theater, so that way they're not in the studio, but they're kind of alone in this other building. There are constant testings that are being held just like in film, and there are also a lot of people that are sitting in on the taping because there isn't a live studio audience, so if there's room in wherever they're filming, There are people that are standing by to make sure that everyone's being safe all the time and constantly kind of supervising to make sure that nothing goes wrong. There's generally some sort of COVID supervisor watching to make sure that everything is being safe. So that was a lot of information, but I think that what I learned from that as I was doing my research, and what I hope that you got a feeling of too, is that filmmaking has changed a lot in the past couple months. I mean, we've been doing this pandemic for close to 9 months now, and I think that we've learned more about it, and I think that filmmaking has even grown a lot from when it started. When people started allowing filmmaking, it was very just, I don't know what to do, and I don't know how do you make a film in a pandemic, but people are learning, and people are growing, and we're getting safer, and we're finding more ways to be COVID compliant while we're filming, and to make shows that appear more and more normal, to restore part of that sense of normalcy without endangering anybody. And I think that as we continue through this, things will continue to get better. Also, until it does, we're finding more ways to get closer back to what we know as normal TV and normal movies without endangering anybody's safety and keeping everybody healthy. Filmmaking is definitely a lot different now than it ever has been before, but no matter what tries to get in the way, the arts are going to find a way to survive. And so is this show, so make sure you join me again next week when I'll be talking about the rise and fall of Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark. Okay, so that's it. Bye.